I heard her before I saw her, a sharp whisper cutting through the quiet hum of the funeral home. "I'm not taking care of that old witch," my daughter-in-law said, just loud enough for the words to find me, and in that moment, standing beside my son's casket, I realized grief was not the heaviest thing in that room, betrayal was, and it settled into my chest with a weight I could not set down. I didn't turn to look at her, didn't let my face betray what I'd heard. I simply kept my eyes on the polished wood in front of me, tracing the grain with a stillness I hadn't known I possessed, because after 72 years of living, of loving, of raising a son who used to reach for my hand without hesitation, I had learned that sometimes silence says more than any confrontation ever could, and besides, there were too many people watching, too many soft murmurs and sympathetic nods, too many strangers who believed they were witnessing a grieving mother, not a woman quietly realizing she had been reduced to an inconvenience. The room smelled faintly of lilies and polished floors, a scent that clung to the back of my throat, and I could hear Rachel moving somewhere behind me, her heels clicking softly as she repositioned herself, no doubt arranging her face into that perfect expression of sorrow she wore so well, the same expression she had practiced over the years whenever she needed to appear kind, supportive, devoted. I had seen it at birthdays, at holidays, at dinners where she would smile across the table while subtly steering conversations away from me, away from anything that reminded Daniel of who he had been before her. And now here she was, draped in black, accepting condolences with gentle nods and soft thank yous, playing the role of the grieving widow while casually discarding me with a sentence she probably thought I would never hear. I tightened my grip on the folded program in my hands, the paper crinkling slightly under the pressure. But I didn't move, didn't speak, because there was something else sitting quietly beneath my grief, something steadier, colder, something that had been placed there 2 days before my son passed. During a phone call I hadn't fully understood at the time. His voice weaker than I had ever heard it. His words careful, deliberate, as if he was choosing each one with purpose. "Mom," he had said, pausing long enough that I could hear him breathe. "If anything happens, just trust Mr. Green." And I remember asking him what he meant, asking if everything was all right, but he had only told me not to worry, that he loved me, that he wanted me to be taken care of, and I had held on to those words without knowing why, replaying them in my mind as I stood there now, listening to the quiet shuffle of guests, the low hum of whispered condolences, and the faint echo of Rachel's voice lingering in my ears, and for the first time since I had received the call that my son was gone, I felt something shift inside me, not a break, not a collapse, but a quiet realignment, as if the world I thought I understood had tilted just enough for me to finally see what had been there all along. Because Rachel thought I was alone, she thought I was weak, she thought I was a burden she would soon be free of, and maybe once, not so long ago, that might have been true, but as I stood there in that room, surrounded by people who believed they knew my story, I realized there was one thing she didn't know, one thing she couldn't see. And it was the only thing that mattered now. My son had already made his choice, and it wasn't her. The service continued in soft, measured tones, the kind meant to comfort, but the words drifted past me like distant echoes, and I found myself watching the small details instead. The way Rachel dabbed at her eyes with a tissue that remained perfectly dry, the way she leaned slightly into each person who approached her as if she needed their support, as if she had not been standing just minutes earlier whispering about me like I was something to be managed, something inconvenient. And I wondered how long she had been rehearsing this version of herself, how many times she had practiced that fragile smile in the mirror, because it was flawless, convincing enough that even Daniel's old friends were placing gentle hands on her shoulder and telling her how strong she was, how lucky he had been to have her, and I stood just a few feet away, invisible. In a way that felt familiar, because this was not the first time I had been quietly moved to the edges of my own family. It had been happening slowly, almost politely, over the years, in ways that were easy to excuse at the time. A missed phone call here, a shortened visit there, holidays that suddenly needed to be shared with her side of the family more often than mine, and each time I had told myself it was normal, that this was what happened when children built their own lives. But standing there now, I could see the pattern more clearly than ever, like pieces of a puzzle finally snapping into place, and it made Daniel's last words echo louder in my mind. Not with confusion anymore, but with a quiet understanding that he had seen something too, something he had not fully explained, but had tried in his own careful way to prepare me for. A man in a dark suit approached me then, his expression respectful, his voice low as he introduced himself as someone from Daniel's office, and I nodded politely, exchanging the expected words, "Thank you for coming." He would have appreciated it. The kind of sentences that carry no real meaning but fill the space where grief makes conversation difficult. And as he stepped aside, I noticed a familiar figure near the back of the room, standing slightly apart from the others, watching rather than participating. Mr. Green, his posture as composed as ever. His presence steady in a way that felt grounding, and when our eyes met, he gave the smallest nod, almost imperceptible, but enough to confirm what I had begun to suspect, that whatever Daniel had set in motion had not been a passing thought or a last-minute decision. It had been deliberate, planned with care, and protected with silence, and I felt my fingers relax slightly around the program as a strange sense of calm settled over me. Not the kind that comes from acceptance, but the kind that comes from knowing there is more beneath the surface than anyone else in the room realizes, because Rachel was still moving through the crowd, still collecting sympathy, still building her version of the story. And I let her speak, let her believe she understood what would come next, because for the first time since I walked into that room I was not thinking about what I had lost, I was thinking about what had already been decided, quietly, carefully, beyond her reach. And I realized that sometimes the truth does not need to be spoken right away. Sometimes it waits just beneath the surface, until the moment it matters most. The pastor's voice rose and fell in gentle waves, speaking about love and memory and the kind of legacy that lives on in the hearts of those left behind. But I found myself listening for something else entirely, something beneath the words, something real, and it came not from the front of the room, but from the quiet conversations that slipped through the spaces between, low voices that thought they were out of reach. And I heard Rachel again, closer this time, standing just behind a group of Daniel's co-workers, her tone softer now but no less sharp. "I do not even know how I am supposed to manage everything on my own," she said, pausing just long enough for sympathy to settle in. "The house, the accounts, all of it, it is overwhelming." And there was a slight emphasis on that last word, as if she was testing it, shaping it, preparing it for something more, and someone murmured something comforting in response, but she continued, lowering her voice just a fraction. "And his mother? Well, I cannot be expected to take that on too." And there it was again, not the exact words from before, but the same meaning wrapped in something more socially acceptable, more polished, and I felt a quiet clarity settle over me. Because this was not grief speaking, this was planning. This was someone already rearranging a life that had not even been laid to rest yet. I shifted slightly where I stood, just enough to catch a clearer view of her face as she turned toward the group, her expression carefully composed, her eyes glistening just enough to suggest tears without ever letting them fall. And for a moment I wondered if Daniel had seen this too. If he had stood in a room like this at some point and noticed the difference between what was said and what was meant, if he had recognized the subtle way she redirected conversations, the way she positioned herself at the center of every decision, every detail, every account. And I remembered a dinner from months ago, a quiet evening that had seemed ordinary at the time, where Daniel had hesitated before answering a simple question about their finances, glancing briefly at Rachel before speaking, as if checking for permission. And I had brushed it off then, told myself it was nothing, that marriages required compromise, but now that memory returned with a different weight, heavier, sharper, and it aligned too neatly with everything I was hearing now. The room shifted as people began to move toward the exit for the graveside portion of the service, a slow procession forming, and Rachel stepped forward, positioning herself where she would naturally be seen, naturally be followed, and as she passed by me, she offered a small, tight smile, the kind that never reached her eyes, and placed a light hand on my arm, just for a second, just long enough for others to notice. "We will get through this," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough to be overheard. And I met her gaze for the first time that day, really met it, and held it for a second longer than expected, long enough to see the flicker of something behind her expression, not guilt, not even discomfort, but calculation. And I nodded once, a simple, quiet acknowledgement, because there was no need to say anything more, not yet. And as she moved past me, returning to her role, I felt that same steady calm settle deeper, the kind that comes not from denial, but from understanding, because she was already building her future, already deciding what she would keep and what she would discard. And she believed I would be the easiest part to remove, the simplest problem to solve, and I almost pitied her for that, because she was moving forward with absolute certainty, unaware that every step she was taking was leading her straight into a reality she had not prepared for, a reality my son had already secured quietly, deliberately, without her ever noticing. The line of cars stretched slowly along the narrow road leading to the cemetery, a quiet procession of polished black and muted colors moving under a gray sky that seemed to press down on everything below, and I sat in the back seat of the car that had been arranged for me, my hands folded neatly in my lap, the same program still resting between my fingers, now slightly creased from where I had held it too tightly for too long, and as the world passed by outside the window, blurred and distant, my mind moved in the opposite direction, pulling me backward through the years to moments I had not fully understood when they first happened. I remembered the first time Rachel had insisted on handling Daniel's paperwork, how she had laughed lightly when I offered to help him organize some documents, saying it was easier if she kept everything in one place, more efficient that way, and Daniel had agreed, nodding without much thought, trusting, always trusting, and I had smiled then, stepping back, telling myself it was natural, that he had chosen a partner and that partner had a right to be involved, but now that memory shifted, taking on a sharper edge, because it had not been a single moment, it had been a pattern, a gradual tightening of control that had happened so smoothly I had barely noticed it at the time. The car slowed as we approached the cemetery gates, the iron bars standing tall and unmoving, and I felt a quiet heaviness settle deeper in my chest, not from the sight of where we were going, but from the realization of how much had been happening beneath the surface while I had been looking elsewhere, trusting that everything was as it appeared. And I thought of another afternoon, not long before Daniel became ill, when he had come by the house alone, something that had grown rare over the years, and he had sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold in front of him, his eyes distant, his words careful, and I had asked him if everything was all right, if work was too much, if he needed anything, and he had hesitated just for a moment before telling me he was fine, that he was just tired, and I had accepted that answer because it was easier, because I did not want to press, did not want to create tension where there was none visible. But now I could see that hesitation clearly, could hear the unspoken words behind it, the ones he had chosen not to share, and it aligned too closely with the quiet urgency in his final call, the way he had told me to trust Mr. Green. Not as a suggestion, but as something more intentional, something prepared. The car came to a gentle stop, and the driver stepped out to open the door, but I remained seated for a moment longer, allowing the silence to settle around me, because stepping out of that car meant stepping into the next part of the day, the part where everything would be finalized, where roles would be solidified in the eyes of everyone watching, and I knew exactly what Rachel believed that role would be for me. Something small, something temporary, something easily set aside once the formalities were over, and I could almost hear her voice again, not the whisper from earlier, but the tone she had used so often over the years when speaking about plans, about the future, about what made sense and what did not, always framed as practicality, always presented as concern, but always leading to the same outcome, her at the center, making the decisions and others adjusting around her. I stepped out of the car then, the air cooler than I expected, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass, and joined the slow movement of people gathering near the graveside, my steps steady, measured, and as I looked ahead, I saw her already there, positioned just where she would be seen first, speaking quietly with someone, her posture composed, her expression carefully arranged, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to observe her the way I should have long ago, not as the woman my son had chosen, not as someone to be accepted without question, but as she truly was, someone who had been shaping her place in this family piece by piece, believing she had accounted for everything, every outcome, every possibility, except one, and as I took my place among the others, I felt that quiet certainty return, stronger now, steadier, because the truth was no longer something I was trying to understand, it was something I was beginning to see clearly, and Rachel, for all her careful planning, had overlooked the one decision that mattered most. The wind moved gently across the open cemetery, lifting the edges of coats and carrying with it the quiet murmur of voices that had softened into respectful silence, and I stood there as the final words were spoken, watching as people bowed their heads, some closing their eyes, others simply staring at the ground as if that alone could hold their grief in place, and I did the same, not because I needed to, but because it gave me a moment to think without being seen, a moment to listen inward instead of outward, and it was there in that stillness that his voice came back to me again, clearer this time, not weakened by distance or memory, but steady, deliberate. Mom, if anything happens, trust Mr. Green. And I realized then that it had not been just a suggestion, not something said out of fear or uncertainty, it had been instruction, something prepared in advance, something he had chosen carefully, and as the pastor stepped back and the small group began to shift, signaling the end of the service. I lifted my head and saw Mr. Green approaching, his steps measured, his expression composed in a way that stood apart from the rest, not untouched by the moment, but not consumed by it either. And when he reached me, he did not offer the usual condolences right away, did not repeat the phrases I had heard too many times already. Instead he gave a slight nod, the same one from earlier, and said quietly, "Mrs. Carter, when you are ready, there are a few matters Daniel asked me to discuss with you." And his tone was careful, respectful, but there was something beneath it, something firm, something that confirmed what I had begun to understand, and I nodded once in return, not asking questions, not drawing attention, because I knew better than to do that here, not in front of Rachel, who had already turned slightly in our direction, her attention shifting with a subtle precision that suggested she was always listening, always watching for anything that might affect her plans. "Of course," I said simply, my voice steady, and Mr. Green gave a small, approving glance before stepping back, allowing others to move between us, maintaining the appearance of a normal exchange, nothing out of place, nothing that would raise suspicion, and I appreciated that more than I could express, because whatever Daniel had set in motion, it had been done quietly, deliberately, with the kind of care that ensured it would remain unseen until the right moment. And as I stood there, accepting a few final words from distant relatives and acquaintances, I could feel Rachel's presence drawing closer, not physically at first, but in the way the space around me shifted, conversations quieting slightly, attention redirecting, and then she was there, stepping beside me with that same controlled expression, her hand lightly resting near my elbow again, not quite touching this time, but close enough to suggest support. "We should head back soon," she said softly, her voice carrying that same practiced calm. "There are a lot of things to take care of." And I turned my head just enough to meet her eyes, holding her gaze for a brief moment, long enough to let the silence between us settle into something heavier than words, and I nodded once, because she was right about one thing. There were things to take care of, things that had already been decided, things she believed she would soon control, and I wondered, not for the first time that day, what her expression would look like when she realized that every assumption she was making, every plan she was quietly forming, had been built on something that no longer existed, because Daniel had not left things unfinished, he had not left me unprotected. And as we began to walk away from the graveside, the crowd slowly dispersing behind us, I felt that quiet certainty settle even deeper, no longer just a suspicion, no longer just a possibility, but something solid, something real, waiting just beyond the surface, ready to be revealed at the exact moment it would matter most. The ride back from the cemetery was quieter than the one before it, the kind of silence that does not need to be filled because everyone believes they understand what it represents. But I knew better now, because silence can hold many things, not just grief. And as Rachel sat beside me in the car, her posture composed, her hands resting neatly in her lap, I could feel the distance between us more clearly than ever, not physical, but something deeper, something shaped by years of quiet decisions and unspoken intentions. And she broke that silence first, her voice soft, measured. "We should probably go over everything when we get back," she said, not looking at me right away, as if the words were meant to sound casual, thoughtful. "There are a lot of responsibilities now, and it would be best to organize things sooner rather than later." And I turned my head slightly toward her, watching the way her expression remained calm, almost concerned, but her eyes were focused, calculating, already moving ahead of the present moment into what she believed would come next. And I nodded once, a simple acknowledgement, because there was no need to challenge her, not yet, and she seemed to take that as agreement, continuing gently. "The house, the accounts, Daniel's business interests. It is going to be a lot to manage." And there was that word again. Manage, always framed as necessity, always presented as something she was willing to take on. And I let a small pause settle between us before answering, my voice steady, quiet. "Yes, there will be things to review." And I could see the slight shift in her posture, the almost imperceptible easing of tension as she interpreted my response as compliance, as acceptance of the role she had already assigned to herself, and she offered a faint, reassuring smile. "Do not worry, I will handle most of it. You should focus on resting, on taking care of yourself." And I watched her for a moment longer, really watched her, the way she positioned her words as kindness, as support, while quietly removing me from every decision, every responsibility, every piece of what she believed was now hers to control. And I realized how practiced she was at this, how natural it had become, not something she thought about consciously anymore, but something woven into the way she spoke, the way she planned, the way she moved through the world. The car slowed as we approached the house, the familiar structure coming into view, and for a brief second, I saw it the way she must have been seeing it for some time now, not as a home filled with memories, but as something else entirely, something measurable, something to be divided, reorganized, claimed, and I wondered how long she had been waiting for this moment, how long she had been preparing for a future where she stood at the center of everything, making the decisions, holding the control, and as the car came to a stop and the driver stepped out, I felt that same calm settle over me again, deeper now, steadier, because I knew something she did not, something she had not accounted for in all her careful planning. We stepped out of the car and moved toward the front door, people following behind us in a quiet stream, voices low, respectful, and Rachel reached for the handle first, opening it with a sense of familiarity that bordered on ownership, stepping inside as if she already belonged to everything within those walls, and I followed a step behind, my pace unhurried, my expression unchanged, because there was no need to rush, no need to interrupt the illusion she was building, not when I could see so clearly now how fragile it was, how dependent it was on assumptions that were no longer true, and as we crossed the threshold, I caught a glimpse of Mr. Green's car pulling in behind the others, his timing precise, his presence steady, and I knew that whatever came next would not be decided by Rachel's plans or expectations, it would unfold exactly as Daniel had intended, and I intended to let it. The house filled slowly with the low hum of voices and the soft clinking of glasses, the kind of polite gathering that follows a day like this, where people linger not because they want to, but because they feel they should, and I moved through it quietly, acknowledging each person with a nod, a few words, never lingering too long because my attention was elsewhere, watching the way Rachel moved through the room with a subtle authority, guiding conversations, directing where people sat, even instructing someone to move a tray from the dining table to the kitchen as if she had already assumed the role of host, of owner, of the one in charge, and I could see how easily others accepted it, how natural it appeared from the outside, because she never raised her voice, never demanded anything outright, she simply suggested, redirected, positioned herself at the center until everything seemed to orbit around her without question. I paused near the hallway, just out of the main flow of guests, and from there I could hear her more clearly as she spoke with a couple I did not recognize, her tone soft but purposeful. Daniel had everything very organized, she said, a faint smile touching her lips. So I will just need to go through the accounts and make sure everything transitions smoothly. And there was that word again, transitions, as if she had already stepped into the future she envisioned, as if there were no uncertainty at all, and one of the guests nodded sympathetically, saying something about how difficult it must be to handle so much at once, and Rachel gave a small practiced sigh. It is a lot, but I will manage, I always do. And there was a quiet confidence in that statement, something that revealed more than she intended, because it was not just about the present moment, it was about control, about certainty, about her belief that everything was already within her reach. I stepped back slightly, allowing the wall to support me for a moment, not out of weakness, but to remain unnoticed, because observation had become more valuable than participation, and as I watched her, I could see how every movement, every word, was part of something larger, something she had been building over time, not suddenly, not impulsively, but with careful consistency, and I wondered if she had ever considered the possibility that something might exist outside of her control, something she had not accounted for, because there was no hesitation in her actions, no sign of doubt, only the quiet assurance of someone who believed the outcome had already been decided. A familiar voice broke through my thoughts then, calm and steady. "Mrs. Carter," Mr. Green said softly as he approached, his presence grounding in a way that felt intentional, and I turned toward him, meeting his gaze, and in that brief exchange, there was no need for explanation, no need for questions, only understanding, because whatever needed to be said would not be said here, not in the middle of this carefully constructed scene, and he inclined his head slightly toward the study down the hall, a subtle gesture, one that could easily be missed by anyone not paying attention, and I followed it with a small nod of my own, acknowledging without drawing notice. Behind us, Rachel's voice carried faintly through the room again, confident, composed, continuing her quiet narrative, shaping how others would see what came next, and I realized then that she was not just planning the future, she was rehearsing it, speaking it into existence as if that alone would make it real, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of something that might have been almost sympathy, because she had built her certainty so completely, so thoroughly, that the truth waiting just beneath the surface would not simply surprise her. It would unravel everything she believed she had secured, and as I turned toward the hallway, moving slowly, deliberately, I understood that the moment Daniel had prepared for was no longer somewhere in the distance. It was approaching quietly, inevitably, and Rachel, for all her careful control, had no idea how close she was to losing it. The hallway felt quieter than the rest of the house, the noise from the gathering fading into a distant murmur as I followed Mr. Green toward the study, a room Daniel had always kept carefully organized, every file in its place, every surface clear, and stepping inside felt like stepping into a space that still held his presence in a way the rest of the house no longer did. And for a moment I paused near the doorway, letting my eyes move slowly across the room, taking in the familiar details. The desk he had worked at late into the night, the bookshelf lined with volumes he rarely had time to read, and it struck me how little I had been invited into this part of his life in recent years, how much had been quietly kept separate, not out of distance between us, but because something else had been shaping the boundaries around him. Mr. Green closed the door gently behind us, the soft click final but not abrupt, and he waited a moment before speaking, as if allowing the silence to settle into something steady, something appropriate for what was about to be said, and when he finally did, his voice was calm, measured. "Your son was very clear about his intentions," he said, not as an introduction, but as a continuation of something already understood, and I felt a small shift inside me, not surprise, not confusion but recognition, because I had already sensed this, already begun to see the shape of what Daniel had done without needing it to be explained in full. Mr. Green moved to the desk and placed a slim folder on its surface, his hand resting lightly on it for a brief moment before he looked back at me, and there was no hesitation in his expression, no uncertainty, only the quiet confidence of someone carrying out a responsibility that had been entrusted to him with purpose. "He came to see me 2 weeks before he passed," he continued, and I stepped further into the room, my movements slow, deliberate, as if matching the careful pace of his words. "He made several changes, not just to his will, but to how his assets were structured." And I could hear the faint emphasis in that sentence, not dramatic, not exaggerated, but intentional, as if each word had been chosen with the same precision Daniel had used when he made those decisions. I stopped a few feet from the desk, my eyes resting on the folder without reaching for it yet, because this moment felt larger than the act of opening it. It felt like the point where everything that had been hidden beneath the surface would begin to take shape, and I realized then that Daniel had not acted out of impulse or fear. He had acted with clarity, with understanding, seeing something that I had only just begun to recognize, and preparing for it in a way that ensured I would not be left to face it alone. From the other side of the door, I could still hear the faint rhythm of voices, Rachel's among them. Steady, confident, continuing her quiet narrative without interruption, and the contrast between that and the stillness of this room felt almost deliberate, as if two different realities were unfolding at the same time, one built on assumption, the other on certainty, and I understood now that the moment those two realities met would not be subtle. It would not be something that could be softened or explained away, because it would not be a matter of interpretation. It would be fact. Mr. Green slid the folder slightly closer to me, not pushing it, not insisting, simply making it available, and I let my hand rest lightly on its edge, feeling the weight of it not just in the paper it contained, but in what it represented, the decisions Daniel had made, the trust he had placed, the protection he had quietly arranged, and I realized that whatever came next, whatever Rachel believed was waiting for her just beyond this moment, was about to shift in a way she could not anticipate because she had built her certainty on something that no longer existed. And as I finally opened the folder, I knew that everything she thought she understood was about to change. I did not rush as I read the first page, my eyes moving slowly over each line, not because I could not understand it, but because I wanted to feel it settle, to let the meaning anchor itself fully before moving on. And the words were clear, unmistakable, structured in the precise language of someone who knew exactly what they were doing, every clause intentional, every detail accounted for. And I felt something steady rise within me, not triumph, not even relief, but something quieter, something stronger, the kind of certainty that does not need to announce itself, because it already knows its place. "All primary assets have been transferred into a protected structure," Mr. Green said calmly, as if guiding me through what I was already beginning to see, "with you designated as the sole controlling beneficiary." And I let that sentence rest in the air between us for a moment, not reacting outwardly, not showing the shift that had just taken place inside me, because I understood now that this was not just a document, it was a decision Daniel had made with full awareness, with clarity about what he was leaving behind and who he was leaving it to, and more importantly who he was not. I turned the page, my finger steady, and there it was again in different terms, reinforced, protected, layered in a way that made it clear this was not something that could be easily contested or redirected. And I thought of Rachel standing just beyond this door, speaking with quiet confidence about managing accounts and overseeing transitions, building her future, piece by piece, in conversations that assumed an outcome that no longer existed. And for the first time, I allowed myself to imagine that moment, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a kind of calm inevitability, because it would not be dramatic, it would not be loud, it would simply be the truth, presented in a way that left no room for interpretation. There are also provisions regarding access and authority, Mr. Green continued, his voice even respectful, which we will go over in detail, but the most important thing for you to understand right now is that Daniel ensured you would not be dependent on anyone else's decisions. And I nodded once because I understood that fully, not just the words but the intention behind them, the care that had gone into making sure I would not be placed in the position Rachel had already assigned to me, something to be managed, something to be handled, something to be quietly set aside. I closed the folder gently, not because I had finished reading, but because I did not need to continue to know what it contained. Not yet, the essential truth had already revealed itself, and I placed my hand flat against the cover for a brief moment, feeling its weight, grounding myself in what it represented, and then I looked up at Mr. Green, meeting his gaze with a calm that felt entirely my own. He knew, I said quietly, not asking, not questioning, simply acknowledging what had become clear, and Mr. Green gave a small, almost imperceptible nod in return, confirming what did not need to be spoken aloud. From the other side of the door, Rachel's voice carried faintly again, still steady, still certain, still building a future she believed was already hers, and I stood there for a moment longer, listening to it, not with resentment, not with hurt, but with a clarity that had not been there before, because the difference between what she believed and what was real had never been wider than it was